This is the Brandon Smith Show. I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and the entire purpose of the show is one singular thing, and that's to help you live a life that much more free from dysfunction. So today I have the awesome privilege of bringing on one of my prior guests, a good friend of mine, Ken Keene. Ken has been on the show before. We talked about leadership, and Ken's going to talk about his background, but Ken, you've got an amazing background that I really admire. So not only do you teach now at Emory's Business School as the Associate Dean of Leadership Development, prior to that, you served your entire career in the military, and you retired as Lieutenant General. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to bring you back on and jam a little bit about leadership. So today we're going to talk about those leadership derailers, those things that get in our way in our careers that we got to be careful to watch out for, because they can be those things that we're on the fast track and can take us off the track and prevent us from making the impact that we want to make. So before we go too far down that path, for those listeners that are new to the show that maybe haven't heard your story before, tell us a little about how you got in the seat that you're in now. What's been this journey for you?
Obviously it all started coming into the Army in December 1974. I'd gone to college and really did not clearly have a vision of what I wanted to do, except my father had taught high school math for a career. I was a math major in college and was sort of led that way. But I on the campus of Eastern Kentucky University, I met an officer who was a Special Forces officer and had just come out of Vietnam. And he convinced me to give ROTC a try after I saw a couple of his cadets rappelling off the side of our one of our campus buildings. I thought that looked exciting, and I'd like to try it. So he convinced me to get into ROTC, and I was working my way through college at the time, and offered me a little incentive with a scholarship, and I ended up coming into the Army, which for me was an opportunity. And what enticed me to that was the opportunity to really get experience as a leader, but also I had never been west of the Mississippi and really never traveled a lot east of the Mississippi, besides right around the states of Kentucky, and had never been overseas. So the idea of going in the military and seeing different things and getting different experiences, and I intended to come in, spend 4 years, and before I knew it, because I loved what I was doing most of the time, but I loved the people I was working with virtually all the time. I just never got out. I turned around one day and I had 38 years of service. And I had the privilege to work with some really high-performing teams and some teams that didn't always perform up to expectations, but I served in some of our most elite organizations in the military, the 82nd Airborne Division, U.S. Army Special Forces, and most prominently the 75th Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I learned a great deal through that. And then my last 9 years in the military I spent as a general officer, primarily working overseas in Latin America, Europe, and then I spent my last 19 months serving in Pakistan. And as I was finishing up my service, I was just sort of trying to decide what to do. I knew I didn't want to go back into selling things back to the military. I really wanted to, what I loved most about the military was working with young leaders. I had benefited from being mentored and through the course of my career, and I really loved working with young leaders over the course of my time in the military. So I decided I wanted to do something around that. My son had been a student here at the Goizueta Business School. After he served in the military, I had met a couple professors here, and they asked me to come back and just do some work with the school around leadership. I started sort of volunteering in that regard, and one thing led to another, and a position came open and so I decided, okay, well, I'll go back full time and come and live in Atlanta.
Rest is history.
The rest is history, and so this August I will have been here 5 years.
No way.
I
can't believe that.
5 school years, if you will. So it's been exciting, and the time flies.
Time does fly.
The longest I've ever lived in one place, in one job,
Really?
Yeah, since I graduated from college. So
I would say my hair keeps getting whiter, but I don't think that's possible, Ken. This is kind of about as white as it's going to get. You know, it's funny. I've heard you tell your story before, but it just seems like this time you told it a little differently than what I'd heard before. And it made me think of a couple of questions I have for you. So you talk about some of those opportunities to serve in some of those very elite units. Was that a decision that you made? Did you say, I really want to join the ranks of the Rangers? Or did someone tap you on the shoulder and said, you should really consider this?
Well, I entered the Army in December 1974, and the Army was really not, as an organization and an institution, was really struggling. And this was right, obviously, after Vietnam had ended. We'd just gone from a draftee army to an all-volunteer army. We were just really making that huge change. So the Army was having to learn how to market itself, and morale and esprit in the Army was really pretty bad. And my first assignment was in Fort Ord, California. I was an infantry officer. I'd been put in charge of an infantry platoon of 30-some soldiers. I was fortunate enough to have some very experienced non-commissioned officers who had been in Vietnam, who were very dedicated, but we had a lot of discipline problems. And after a year in that unit, I said, if this is what the Army is about, I'm not sure I will make it a career and stay long term. So I started looking around what other opportunities there were in the Army, and they were forming a Ranger battalion at that time. I volunteered for it, wasn't selected, but I was offered to volunteer for Special Forces. And because of my mentor in college, that was something I was interested in at the time. So I took that opportunity. I went to language school that was right there at the Defense Language Institute in Presidio of Monterey in California for 6 months. And I went through their selection process and ended up in the Republic of Panama serving in Special Forces. And then I volunteered a couple times after that to get to the Rangers again. Wasn't selected. So on the third time, about 12 years later, I ended up eventually being selected to serve in the Rangers. But it was just what led me there was to try to be a member of an organization that had a reputation of being the very best, and I just wanted to experience that.
So in retrospect, would you have done anything differently?
No, I thought it was very important in retrospect to get that early experience of being in a place where things didn't function as well as we would like for them to. And that unit that I was in, 7th Infantry Division, actually turned around and later became an exceptional division in and of itself. But I think that path of having that tough experience at the beginning, I worked for some exceptional leaders even in that unit, and I worked for some leaders that weren't so exceptional as well. And I learned probably more from the latter than the former, but I learned from both of them.
Yeah, fantastic. This is great. I mean, just hearing you talk, I think to myself, we could have hours of podcast just asking you questions. So let's talk about leadership derailers. When you think about your career and you think about officers in the military, you also think about even students today. What are some of those derailers? I know we talked a little bit offline about you came up with 3.
Yeah.
So let's start with maybe the first one. What's the first one that you see as a derailer that we need to be aware of in our careers?
Well, I think the 3 that really came to mind when you asked me about this that have commonalities between my experience in the military and what I see working with students and business leaders in Atlanta and particularly at Goizueta Business School. The first one is not giving 100%. In the military, we say you need to give 100% and then some, but not doing everything you can do every day to be a contributing to the team. In the business school, we call it the individual's not doing this, the freeloader.
Yeah.
So if you're the freeloader in the team or you're not giving 100%, then most likely that is going to derail you at some point. But what I've seen, particularly in the military, is recognition that every day everybody may not be up to giving 100%. Then it becomes to, is there a culture within the team and the organization such that people are willing to stand up and say, hey, look, today I know I'm supposed to deliver this, but for whatever reason, I need help. I need somebody else to step up and carry the weight today. In the military, it takes a team to win, but on any given time, there are certain members of the team that may be able to do more than others and carry a little bit heavier load. So it's that recognition that that not only is somebody trying to avoid doing more, but recognition that maybe for whatever reason in your personal life or just that you've taken on too much, you're not ready to give everything you can.
So this seems really complicated in some ways, because on the one hand, I'm hearing you say this general idea of jump in, make sure you're giving 100%, 110%, really giving everything you can, saying yes to things when people come to you and say, hey, we really need your help. You're the one to solve this problem, which makes a lot of sense. That's kind of where we get on people's radars. But I'm also hearing you added this subtlety at the end where it's almost like that can go too far.
That's right.
And then now you can't give 100% to anything.
That's
because
right.
you're spread too thin.
So it becomes this how to say no.
Yeah.
And so what's...
I'm working on this.
Yeah, so am I. I'm not very good at saying no. This is one of those things where I recognize that I have a potential derailer of my own, ability to say no.
Yeah.
And how do you do that without letting somebody down? And maybe you owe them a yes because they've done you a favor in the past. So how do you do that without derailing other things you're doing? Or you have to go back and say, hey, look, I need to take on something else right now that's come up. Here's the reason I need to do it. But having the openness with the team that you're working with is going to be having to function with you giving less than 100%. And then I think as a leader, obviously in most cases, all of us are somewhere in the organization have those that we have to report to. Even if we're the CEO, we have a board generally. But if you're a mid-level leader, you've got other leaders that are depending upon you and peers. So how do you give everyone your time and effort and recognize that you have to prioritize, and your most precious resource is your time?
Yeah, so I'm hearing you say that, and I'm going to ask you another question about this because this is something that's very complicated for a lot of people, hard for a lot of people. But I'm hearing you say at the end, you know who your key stakeholders are, those key people that you're supposed to be serving and supporting, that are really reliant on you,
right,
and prioritize them first.
Right.
And then if you have any extra time, you can give it to others, but really know those people that they're really relying on you,
right,
and they need you the most.
And the other thing that I think is know what only you can do as a leader. There may be others that could do what you're being asked to do as well, and maybe they could do it just as well or better than you. So maybe you're not the only one that can do what you're being asked to do. So trying to figure out how to delegate that, if you will, and how not to take on too much. And I think this gets to a part of, what I talk to leaders a lot about micromanaging. As you go up in the organization, you got to get more comfortable with letting go, delegating more, because if you don't, you'll be overwhelmed and you'll get to the point of what I call this is part of this derailer, in the sense that you're not giving 100%. You're not giving everything 100% because you've taken on things that you probably shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, so I've got another question for you, but we're going to go to break. So when we come back, I'm going to ask you a question particularly about your experiences with this, because this is something I think that I just know for me, I struggle with this. I know so many people listening to this struggle with this, but it's an important one to be able to manage that inflection point. So stay tuned. We're going to go right into break. When we come back, we're going to continue our journey talking with my friend Ken Keene about leadership derailers. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, this is Brandon. I want to take a moment to thank you for listening to my show. We wouldn't have a show without you. In an effort to get you the topics, guests, and resources that'll make your life better, I need your help. Go to theworkplacetherapist.com, www.theworkplacetherapist, all one word, .com, and take the listener survey that's all about you and your needs. We'll be giving away a $50 Amazon gift card to one lucky listener. I look forward to hearing from you. Let's eliminate dysfunction together. Welcome back to the Brandon Smith Show. So if you have been listening to us before the break, which I'm sure you have been, we've been talking about leadership derailers. And our first derailer is this idea of making sure you're always giving 100%. And underneath that means time's your most precious resource, and you can't be saying yes to everything. You got to learn to say no. And so, Ken, right before this, you had talked about kind of knowing what's the thing that really only you can do. Because people might ask you to do something, but you can say, well, yeah, but there's a lot of other good leaders that are also capable of that. So this is one of the questions I want to ask you. In your career, what'd you learn for you? What is that thing for you or things for you that you found as a leader was particularly one of your gifts that you were good at, that it might be harder to find other leaders who could do it?
Well, I found that as I went through my career, what I was really good at was interacting with the people around me and my subordinates and the other leaders, and working to them to understand their organization. One of the challenges I found as I went up in the organization, so I went from commanding 1st Ranger Battalion in Savannah, Georgia, organization of about 800 to 1,000 Rangers, to commanding the Ranger Regiment, the headquarters that's above that battalion and 2 other battalions, one in Fort Lewis, Washington, and one in Fort Benning, Georgia. So it was an organization of about 3,000. And so I went out, it took that...
And that represented all the Rangers?
Yes. And so when I took that promotion, if you will, and took on that job, you're prepared for it from experience level, but you've never experienced that job. At the battalion level, my job was really, you're focusing on those Rangers you have, deploying anywhere in the world, and being ready to go at the tactical organizational level. Well, at the next level, it's really more about organization and strategic level and getting resources for the other battalions. After having been in command a couple months, my executive officer, your staff officer who's really managing your staff, came in to me and said, I had a good relationship, I'd known him for years, came in and said, you're the best operations officer in the Ranger Regiment right now. And I looked at him and says,
that almost feels like a backhanded compliment.
Tim, I'm not trying to be the best operations. I said, I know, but you are. But if you would let our operations officer do his job, he would be the best. And turns out he was much better operations officer than I was. But what he was telling me is you need to let go.
Yeah.
You need to let go. You're very comfortable dealing in operations and that. But what I needed to be doing was looking a lot of my time outside the organization in terms of how to enable them to be successful, understanding the resource requirements. So that was a piece of feedback that I needed.
That you listened to.
Yeah, that helped me grow into that position.
Yeah, they often talk about this entrepreneurial adage that entrepreneurs have to go from working in their business to on their business. But I find that's true for leaders today. They've got to learn to work from working in it, right, which is more the details, to on it. And it sounds like that was a big pivot point for you in your career.
Right.
Because you had a role where you had to really think more on it. How do I get resources for all these battalions versus the day-to-day operations?
Right.
Yeah, wow, fantastic. Okay, well, like I said, I could ask you more questions on this, but I recognize time is is our most precious resource, and it's ticking. So how about our next derailer? So we talked about the first one, not giving 100% to what you're really focused on. What's the next one?
Well, the next one I thought of is a challenge, I think, in any organization at any level, and it certainly transcends my military experience into what I'm working with our MBA students, and that is learning from your mistakes. Easy said, harder to do. And then applying that to be better, to be a better person, and to be better to help your team's performance improve. And this, again, I think we're all challenged to make sure we learn from those mistakes by reflecting on what we're doing, what's working, what's not working, and where we can improve and how we can learn from that. I think there's a song that says, life lived is lessons learned. I don't agree with that. Life lived is not lessons learned, because you have to reflect and figure out what behaviors you're going to change in order to get better based upon things that are not working. So just because you lived an experience doesn't mean you've learned from it.
Yeah, okay. It's kind of like wisdom is optional.
Yes.
Right? You can go through life. It doesn't necessarily mean if someone's older, they're wiser, unless they've really thought about what have I learned from those experiences. I often find, I'd be curious your thoughts on this. I often find not everyone wants to learn from their mistakes.
No.
So how, when you were working with maybe junior officers and they were coming up and you were trying to kind of coach them or guide them, how would you help them overcome that?
Well, it gets to this aspect of, I think, talking about if you want to lead others, you have to first be able to lead yourself. And that's the discussion I have with them. You have to learn to lead yourself, meaning you have to have a great sense of self-awareness. You need to know where your strengths are, and you need to know where areas are that you can develop. You need to leverage those strengths, but not ignore areas that you can develop and learn from. And at the same time, you need to deliberately reflect on your not own performance, but that of your team. So in the military, we have processes. We have processes for everything, but we have processes for this that are decades old, and it's called, for teams, it's called after-action reviews. Mm-hmm. So it is embedded in the culture of our military and all our services to, after a mission, after a training event, after anything you do, you sit down with your team and you talk about what worked, what went well, what didn't go well, what individually did we do that we could do better on, and then you need to take that and say, what's the one or two things we need to change here, either through our individual behavior or through the team behavior, to make sure that when we go back and do this again, we can do it better. So we've actually applied those processes in a business school to try to teach teams how to do that. Individually, I think peer assessments is a powerful tool. We use it in the military and various schools to get feedback from your peers, because how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us are not always totally aligned, and then having a discussion around that.
Yeah, so in the business world, we call those 360 feedback.
Right.
When often I'll see in organizations right about director level, people will start having that available to them.
Yeah. And I encourage people, because giving and receiving feedback is very difficult in a lot of environments, particularly when you're just becoming a member of the team. Everyone, no one wants to ruffle each other's feathers. You want to, obviously, giving tough feedback is hard in any circumstance. I encourage leaders to ask for feedback. Sit down with somebody you've developed a relationship and say, hey, look, I'm trying to get better at doing this. Do you have a couple ideas on how I could do this better? That will start a conversation much different than if I sit down with you and start telling you where you're going wrong and what my ideas are on for improvement. It works better if you're soliciting feedback on something.
Yeah, so create more of an appetite for that, so people will proactively go out and seek it. Yeah, and it's funny when people have asked me. Commonly this year, they've said, well, what? This is typically when they're interviewing me for a coaching engagement. They'll say, well, what makes a successful coaching engagement? And I think they want to hear all the things about me. And I come back and I say, it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with that individual.
Right.
And first is if they have at least a somewhat average or above average level of emotional intelligence, then they can read what we're saying and understand it better.
Right.
But second, and probably most importantly, is coachability. Are they willing to hear the tough feedback and lick their wounds. It's okay. They can go off and lick their wounds for a while.
Right.
But then really absorb it and want to do something with it.
Right.
Not everybody has that.
Right.
But that little, it sounds like that, if you've got that willingness in you, it can allow you to go to the next level.
If you're willing to open that door and start that conversation and have that tough, either with a coach, and I think we in our military, in the last 10 years in particular, have gone a long ways in terms of providing executive coaches. Generally, these are retired military non-commissioned officers and officers who are brought in to help active duty as they get ready to go in command, understand their 360s, which they all have to take, and give them and have a discussion around just that. What can you take away from this that will help you as a leader be even better as you go into your next level job?
Okay, so if we go back, we said 2 derailers. Our first one is not giving 100%. The second one is this idea of not learning from mistakes. So there was 3. What's our third one?
Well, I think the third one is one that I mentioned because I think it can be the most catastrophic. Not that it is the most, the one that maybe is most frequent, can be the most catastrophic, and that is ethical violations. Certainly, you see that in all sectors of society, whether it's in government, public service, or just in businesses, where leaders have spent 20 years building up their reputation, and then through to an ethical violation or perceptions of ethical violations, they completely are derailed and have to either resign, step aside, or whatever. And then rebuilding that reputation after the fact is extremely difficult, if not impossible. We see this in the military, obviously, as well. And we work at this hard, as I think in our education system, hopefully institutions do as well, in terms of how do you make leaders aware of the leading with character and the foundations. Obviously, most people, if you ask them what their values are, they would say integrity is one of those. And all great organizations and leaders who aspire to be the best are going to say, I need to be an ethical leader, obviously. But it's living it and living that gray area in terms of doing what's right, I think, is a pitfall that is out there for every leaders, because you're going to have to make hard decisions sometimes, and many of them have ethical implications around them.
This is a tricky one because there's an old adage, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
We're all kind of broken, incomplete people. We all have our soft spots, and power can make that more amplified. So what have you seen work well for people to kind of keep that in check?
Well, it's I think for a certain degree, it's about, have you built a culture around you and in your organization where people are willing to give you feedback in a manner that is open and candid. When people, like you said, total power corrupts totally, in the sense that if they've got people around them that aren't going to walk in the door because they're afraid you're going to flame them out or throw them out of the office if you say anything derogatory or negative, or saying, hey, there's some negative connotations around your expenditures of funds or what you're doing here or there, having those type of conversations, what's going on, or your personal behavior. I tell leaders all the time, you can't just choose to be a leader from 8 to 5. When you're a leader, if you're truly going to be a leader, it's 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So what you do on Saturday night downtown counts. And so your behavior all the time is part of who you are as a person, and that's part of your reputation. So having people giving you feedback and having somebody around you that will do that. And I think a lot of times what we see is people who, ascend to the very highest level sometimes keep the same small group of people around them who may insulate them from that type of tough feedback. And that's where I think the likelihood of getting derailed becomes the most prominent.
Yeah, so I love that. Keep that culture where people give you feedback and not just an insulated group.
Right.
And this idea that, it's a 24/7 job. I mean, you're on stage. And I think that's also part of it too for people, is the more senior they get, the more that they may forget that everyone's watching them.
Right.
They may not realize that they're being watched on what they're saying, not saying, doing, not doing.
Exactly.
And then people read into that.
Right.
They'll say, "Oh, did you see he spent a lot of time with that person?"
Yeah. Or if your organization has a policy that we don't fly people first class inside the United States, and you're always going first class, even if you're paying for it yourself. Others in the company who are getting on the airplane, seeing you're in first class, don't know that.
Yeah.
So there's a perception that there's an ethical issue here, where there may not be, but nevertheless there's a perception.
Yeah, so managing that, absolutely. Okay, so we're right there at the clock. So you remember from our last time, I asked every guest this question: what is one life hack for us? Something we can do to make our lives, either professionally or personally, a little more free from dysfunction. What would that be?
Well, I thought about that this time too, as I came over. But in particular, for me, I think it is, thinking about how you start your day and how you finish your day. And I think we can get into the trap of waking up in the morning and just rushing into the office and then working all day and then rushing home and opening our computer and continuing to work. I found, and I wasn't very good at this, quite frankly, for a long time, but our military forces us to generally in all organizations be at 0600 in the morning, be at PT formation. So you start your day doing physical training. And I found, since I've retired, that being able to start my day some way, whether it's with some level of physical fitness or it's just some way to relax, think about the day, and as well at the end of the day, being able to reflect on that. I encourage people to find ways to break the routine of just being totally immersed in what you're doing at work every day, and start your day right, end your day right, and so that you can give 100%.
Yeah, so be able to just those times that not only set the right way, but physically, but even mentally.
Yeah.
And then decompress it the same way.
Right.
Both physically or mentally.
Right, exactly.
Fantastic. Ken, so if people want to follow you or learn more about what you're up to these days at the business school, how could they do that?
Well, they can do that through Twitter, at Dean Ken Keene,
Okay.
or through Facebook.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you, as always, for coming on the show and giving us more and more great insights. I feel like I just scratched the surface.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brent.
Of course. And thank you for listening, and continue to join our fight every week as we take up the mantle against workplace dysfunction. Of course, you can follow us on Facebook.com, Facebook.com/Brandon Smith WPT for Workplace Therapist, Twitter at the WP Therapist. Check out my website, The Workplace Therapist, for more resources for you. And of course, we drop a new show every Sunday at 9:30 p.m., so be on the lookout for that. Until our next show, have a great week and an awesome life.